Welcome back to the Autoblog podcast. I'm Greg Migliore. Joining me today on the phones is news editor Joel Stocksdale. How are you?
Doing all right.
Yeah, me too. It's kind of early December. It's getting chilly here in Michigan, which is great because we've been driving some very capable sport utility vehicles. I spent about a week in the 2021 Chevy Suburban. A little while back, you drove the Tahoe. They both are significantly refreshed for 2021. These are among the biggest SUVs that General Motors makes. It's interesting. They don't redesign them very much. And when they do, I always find the approach, what they do, what they don't do, to be, again, very interesting. And we'll get into that, touch on some of the other SUVs that do relate to this. And more recently, though, you did drive the Lexus GX 460. I can't wait to hear about that. I think that's one of the more attention-getting Lexus SUVs. But more on that to come as well. We'll do a quick news hit on a 1930, air quotes, you can't see me, but it's a 1930 Bentley. The Bentley Blower is coming back, if you will, a continuation. Automakers have been kind of doing this. It's like a trend, if you will, in recent years, bringing back some of the greatest hits. This one is just a 90-year interval. Joel wrote the story. He can take you through that. Finally, we will spend your money. So let's get right into it. The 2021 Chevy Suburban. This is one of the longest running nameplates in the automotive industry. It goes all the way back to 1935. At that point, these were basically farm work and, military vehicles going all the way back there. The Suburban evolved throughout the years. This is what they're calling the 12th generation, the first since 2015. Some major enhancements. The Spotlight feature is a diesel engine. This is the Duramax that's shared with a number of other large GM SUVs, as well as the Sierra and the Silverado. For me, that caught a lot of my attention driving the vehicle, just because you don't see that many diesels in sort of light-duty vehicles like this. They were kind of a fad for a little bit, but then it kind of went out of style, if you will. Like, Fiat Chrysler was really into them. They had the Ram Eco Diesel. They do have the Ram Eco Diesel. But you saw you saw diesels make their way into other engines, like, the Grand Cherokee. I feel like the diesel scandal with Volkswagen cooled off the technology. People maybe were a little reticent to try to market this idea when there was so much bad publicity out there. General Motors, I don't think, is going to have that problem with a name like Duramax. If you're into diesels, you're going to consider this. If you're not, you're probably not. I interviewed one of their executives last week, and she, basically was taking a wait and see approach as far as like take rate. Maybe they know, I don't know, but they weren't telling me. And, I think they expect there to be some interest in this. It's hard to say if it's going to be a sizable share or not. I would guess maybe more people will be favoring diesels in the pickups versus the SUVs. That said, I really enjoyed my week in the Suburban. It is, it's very well done for 2021. A key part that's, I think, significant for this, for the Suburban and the Tahoe, and I'd like to hear your take, Joel, is the interiors are much nicer. Before, it was basically a truck interior, and if it's a Ram truck, that's a great interior. F-150, maybe not so much. Then there's the Silverado and the Colorado, and frankly, those Chevy truck interiors have always been, even in the high country trims, to me a little bit, not great, Bob, I guess. Let me put it that way. This interior I found to be very nice. So I think that's a major part of this redesign, this new generation. There's also a new independent rear suspension, which adds cargo space in the back, and it really helps the handling. It makes it so, yes, it's still a very large sport utility vehicle. There's still a lot behind you. I kind of walked it off. It's literally like the back window is like 5 yards from where you sit up front. It's a big vehicle. But it handles pretty well in spite of all of that. Again, I try not to overly index on the diesel part of this, if you will, because you can still get the tried and true 5.3 liter V8 and the 6.2 liter V8. The 6.2 is standard in the high country trim, and they're compelling. But after a week driving this thing, I mean, my takeaway is if you're going to put some highway miles on your car, on your SUV, diesel's something worth considering. It's a slight surcharge. I want to say like $9.95 is an option on most of the trims. You can't get it on the off-road Z71, which I think would be a riot just to get a diesel, take it on the trails. But overall, I really liked it. I think it really probably gets to the top of the segment. I think it edges out the Ford Expedition because I think the Expedition is probably better looking. It's a little flashier. But inside, it starts to fall apart a little bit, and maybe you want to look at like a Navigator or an Aviator or something like that. The Expedition is also very expensive. The Suburban, I felt, this one cost nearly 80 grand, but I also was testing out a Premier with the premium package. I can't make this stuff up, right, folks? This one was 79 grand. So with, again, a few options on it. But to me, it felt worth it. Would I, for that money, maybe kind of try to step into like Yukon territory or Yukon XL territory, perhaps, simply because an $80,000 SUV, the Yukon has that kind of luxury vibe with those really big headlights and those big wheels. But again, you really can't beat the Chevy value, I think, especially the range of like options and trim packages available on the Suburban and the Tahoe. So that's my like mini monologue. You spent some time in the Tahoe, which essentially got the same update. Very important vehicle. They sell a lot of them. The Tahoe is just a little bit smaller. So, I mean, it's in some ways it's a vehicle that is slightly more mainstream. I mean, you need to have a big family with like a lot of stuff to haul if you're going to buy a Suburban. But what do you think of these, the Tahoe updates?
Yeah, so far I've been really impressed with the Tahoe, and I've also spent some time in the Yukon Denali, and both of them, like they do comfort and kind of cushiness quite well. They're quiet. They ride nicely, and like I'm actually fairly impressed with kind of like the powertrain and even kind of the handling. The steering actually feels pretty nice on these things. And like the transmission is super, super smooth. And if you can get it with the magnetic ride control, that's the way to go because it offers super smooth ride. It helps get rid of a lot of the like kind of shimmies and shudders that you can find in body on frame SUVs. And it also returns surprisingly nice handling. You don't get a lot of body lean or anything.
I'd agree with that for sure. Magnetic ride control really makes a difference, but go on.
And the ones that I've driven them with the 5.3 liter V8 and also I think the Denali I had the 6.2 liter. The 5.3 is fine. It's not terribly quick, but it gets you where you need to go, and it makes a good noise because it's a V8. But if you do need to have a little bit of giddy up and go, the 6.2 liter is definitely worth the extra money. It offers quite a bit more pep. I have not driven the diesel yet. I would really like to drive one sometime, in part because everything I've heard is that it's actually really smooth and refined for a diesel. Whenever I've driven one of the eco diesels from FCA, either in the Ram or in the Wrangler, it's definitely diesel-y. Like it's got kind of that clatter and turbo whistle and is a little bit unrefined, which on one hand can be kind of fun. On the other hand, it can be a bit intrusive if you just want just a quiet, smooth, uninterrupted driving experience. So I was kind of curious what your thoughts on the diesel in that regard are.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The first time I drove this, we went up to just this downtown near us that's all lit up, and it was totally like cold start. The car had actually sat for maybe a day after it was dropped off. And I didn't tell my passengers, hey, this is a diesel. So started up, there's a little bit of a kind of a burble. In some of the things you mentioned, like you can notice there's a little bit of that kind of like turbo diesel, like, demeanor. but you really don't notice it too much. It's not intrusive. I would say sort of as I don't know, let me put this way. As like a car person, I almost forgot about it. Like you don't fixate on it. You notice and like acknowledge those diesel traits, but they're not overbearing and they move on. And I think even like, my passengers were like, they might notice something's a little bit amiss, if you will. Amiss probably isn't the right word, but is different than a traditional gasoline fed engine. But nobody like thinks about it, dwells on it, or even I think is like bothered by it. So um, I actually think it's pretty good. It's not intrusive. It's not diesely in that sense. It didn't bother me at all. And I try to like sort of look at that with an awareness that I'm not only am I hyper aware of diesel characteristics, but also as sort of like a car guy, I get used to it, whereas like somebody who isn't one of those like people, if you will, might not notice it, but then they also like might be annoyed by it once they do. So in some ways, I guess that's good and bad, but good engine. Wasn't, I think the good parts of diesel, like the low end torque, you notice that it feels relatively quick off the line. Like I've driven large GM vehicles with that 5.3 liter. That's a good engine, but it's kind of lumbery. You know what I mean? Like it can take a bit to get, like a Yukon, if you will, where you want to go. Still very capable for towing and hauling and things like that. And the 6.2 liters, I'd say a little bit better. Diesel, you're getting 460 pound-feet of torque at like 1500 RPM. That'll move a Suburban. I mean, it's not bad. So I was not offended by any of the like, the negative connotations that are associated with diesel. They weren't, to me, omnipresent, if you will. They weren't like in your face, anything like that. If you're a car person, though, you'll notice them. And then the good things, like, I mean, I expected to really kind of drain the tank a little bit, and I really didn't. Like, I drove a lot too. I tried to drain the tank. I actually went to like a light fest, like a stay in your car light fest. Still couldn't get the thing below like even near half. GM just put out like the EPA ratings, so I'd have to do some math to see what like the total range is for a tank of diesel fuel is. But I mean, the Suburban has a pretty big gas tank, and when you're getting that kind of fuel economy, it's you could go pretty far in that thing. So yeah, I mean, let me put it this way: it's not a crazy cost situation, like 995 on most trims. And if you're going to do like some highway commuting and you want to get those good fuel economy figures on the highway, the Suburban is definitely, I think, something to consider in that sense. And then it's also good, obviously, for towing and hauling. I was just going over the specs this morning. They don't have specific numbers for like the four wheel. For the two wheel, it's very good. I mean, just in my mind, it's like I do feel like diesel is going to be a little bit of a hill to climb for a lot of American consumers. Like they just are going to be like, yeah, I don't want a diesel Tahoe. But I feel like if you're willing to like avail yourself of that opportunity, you're going to really potentially like what you see. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm super excited about the diesel just because the fuel economy is remarkable. The fact that you can get 28 miles per gallon on the highway in the Tahoe or 27 in the Suburban is just, it's mind-blowing. And I think for me, probably the sweet spot, because you mentioned how your Suburban, the Premier with all the options on it, was getting pretty pricey. I would definitely lean to the Yukon Denali if you're going to spend that kind of money, because the Yukon Denali does get a very significant interior upgrade. It's got a completely unique interior. It's got real wood trim and like fancy stitching, and it actually feels relatively luxurious while also not feeling quite as like glitzy and like downtown gala feeling as like an Escalade. It has a little bit of ruggedness to it still.
So I'm curious, even just looking at all three of them, really the Escalade is kind of its own thing. there was a little bit of like controversy when the Silverado came out a few years ago. Like, wow, that is not how the last gen Silverado looked. And a lot of people said, well, hey, if that's what you're going to do to the Silverado, I'm going to go get a Sierra. And we actually saw Silverado sales dip for a bit. The Ram kind of inched ahead of them for a while there. I think the styling is caught on. I think, especially depending on the trim you get, I think it looks pretty good. I really do. In some ways, it's Chevy trucks have had at times a little bit of like curves to them. And I think it's a really good look. I just think coming off the really boxy look of the previous gen Silverado and, large Chevy SUVs, people weren't quite ready for it. And then, the truck didn't have a great interior, which they then had to try to fix. But I think all that being said, I think it looks pretty good on the SUVs. Those headlights are kind of like tapered. The fenders are kind of curvy. I think it's a good look. I think the Tahoe in particular, like in the Z71 trim, really good looking. I really like the Suburban. It's super anonymous in this kind of battleship gray that I tested it out in, but you get those kind of like boomerang, like LED daytime running lights. And there's a little bit of attitude there that you didn't used to see in GM SUVs. They were very much like almost enclosed pickup trucks. And that's what they were for a huge chunk of their life. But I'm curious, do you have a preference like Yukon or Tahoe / Suburban as far as the looks department?
I don't know that I've got a particularly strong feeling either way. The Tahoe and Suburban are definitely toned down a lot from the Silverado as far as exterior design, with the exception of the Tahoe Z71. That's got a pretty over the top front end. I'm not entirely.
I really like that front end. I think that looks just sick. Like really, really good looking in my opinion.
I'm of two minds on it. Part of me appreciates the aggressiveness, but part of me is also kind of like they might have gone a little too far in some spots, but
yeah, I mean that grill. I mean
it's a lot.
It's a lot for sure. Chevy has swung and connected and swung and missed on some of their grills. Like what was it, the 18 Camaro or whatever they did? Remember where like that beam that bisects it was kind of like blacked out, I think, or like body colored. People are just like, it doesn't look like the car even has a grill.
Yeah, that was a bad redesign, and it was bad because they fixed it for the following model year.
For sure.
But yeah, I think I would probably just lean toward the Yukon just to get the Denali because the interior upgrade is really nice. The regular Yukons have the same interior as the Tahoe, which is still a good interior. I would still give it a slight edge over the Expedition. But the Yukon Denali is actually a legitimately really nice place to be. And I would combine that with the diesel engine, like you've got a luxurious, fuel efficient super hauler.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the Yukon in some ways has a really good combination of like a bit of rough and tough look to it. Not a bit. It's a pretty rough and tough vehicle. Almost a Transformer look. To the point of maybe being a little cartoonish at times, but overall I do like that. When I saw them when they first came out, I tended to lean Yukon. Now that I've been through several of them, I'm starting to feel maybe a little more like Tahoe, but also in the looks department. But also, again, it's very trim specific. It's same with the trucks. And I would also say this, Suburban is such an iconic nameplate. I think I almost put it not quite with Land Cruiser, but you're getting into like similar price points, actually. Long running, enormous SUVs. But the Suburban is now very competitive in my mind with like anything out there. Same with the Tahoe. Whereas like the Land Cruiser is like the land before time, if you will. So I think if you want that kind of like Chevy Suburban, maybe you're a longtime Suburban owner, maybe you've always owned Chevys, I see why you go that way. But a Yukon or a Yukon XL is a really nice blend between like just that pure like luxury Escalade versus, well, you just spent 80 grand on a Chevy. So, there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance that I think starts to creep in when you see just how much some versions of the Suburban and the Tahoe cost.
Yeah. And one kind of like final note, you mentioned how big the Suburban is. Like it's gigantic now. Not that it was ever small. Um, but I would say to anybody considering one, take a hard look at a Tahoe before you look at a Suburban, because the Tahoe has gotten much larger this generation, and it has a very usable third row seat. Like I could sit behind myself. So like I could have the driver's seat where I want it, the second row seat where I want it, and I could still be comfortable in the third row. And you would still have some cargo space left over. Um, so before you think you have to go get a Suburban, think a lot about like what your use case is, because you can probably get away with a Tahoe now, just because it's grown so much.
That's a great point. Just calling up the press kit here. The 2021 Tahoe is 6.7 inches longer, so over half a foot than the 2020 Tahoe. You get 3 more inches of legroom and 10 more inches in the third row, plus 10 more cubic feet of cargo space in the third row. And that actually directly plays into something I was going to bring up, and that's that the Tahoe in particular was always very big. It seemed big. But sometimes once you like packed it up with a couple of coolers, and if you had the third row up, or you tried to throw a bike in there, or like, maybe you were going camping for like a long weekend, that thing filled up quickly. And it was almost like, this is supposed to be one of the larger vehicles on the market, and it was not as capable as far as just like straight up hauling stuff as you might think. We went camping in a Tahoe, 2, 3 years ago now. Had a great time. We're even able to sleep in it because it is that big. You put the seats down and away you go. But I mean, just 2 of us at that point. We didn't even have the dog at that point. We really filled that thing up with just tents and sleeping bags and coolers. And it was like fishing poles. Like, well, geez, this is just 2 people in a Tahoe. Like, I don't know. I was less than impressed with the storage and usability in the back, especially with those like gargantuan wheel wells and just the way that like the fenders were like paneled. So I think they've done a lot to really remedy that situation. In the Suburban, for me, essentially, it's been a while. GM doesn't actually put these in the fleets very much just because they don't change them very much. It had been a while since I had driven either vehicle. And then you get in the new Suburban, which is even bigger than it was before. And in my mind, coming off that sort of like Tahoe like experience, you get in the new Suburban, which is, get this, it's 4.1 inches longer between the wheels. It's only an inch longer overall, and then you get a couple more inches just in the second and third row. It felt huge compared to like what I was sort of, calibrating for as far as these like SUVs. And that's, to me, that's a credit to General Motors. They knew they kind of had a little bit of a problem there. Hey, these things are huge, but they don't hold that much. Like, that's a problem. And now, I mean, hold that much relatively speaking, but now they're, inside they're huge, and that's a great thing. One question for you, I'm curious. The Expedition is very important. It's a huge vehicle for Ford. I take like Lincoln out of it a little bit, but then when you bring GMC in, you can kind of bring the Navigator back into the equation. But the Navigator also kind of like competes more with the Escalade. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this experience. And I think, when you look at the GMC, like the Yukon, I think a Chevy buyer who's got some money would be willing to step into that. Whereas the Expedition buyer, I think, may not want to go into Lincoln territory, even though it's got a great interior, simply because I think there's some people that are like, let me drop 80 grand on an Expedition, I'll get everything, and then I just have this big SUV versus I'm going to go buy a Lincoln. Like, I think that's still a hill that's too far for some people. So GM or Ford, who do you think's reigning supreme in this kitchen stadium segment, if you will?
Yeah, I think I'm going to give the edge to GM. Mainly because they just offer so much selection now. You can choose anything from a Chevy up to a Cadillac, and you've got GMC very comfortably in between that offers that with the Denali you can get more luxury, but without having sort of that ultra flashy, wealthy look. Still, it still has a little bit of that kind of quote unquote of the people feel to it, whether that's true or not. I mean, it's kind of like a King Ranch F-150 where like it's incredibly expensive and very luxurious, but because it still says Ford on it and still looks kind of rugged, it doesn't give off the same vibe as like a Mercedes or something. So you have lots of model choice and trim choice. And like the Escalade has some really cool technology. It's got Super Cruise and it has the big OLED screens in it for instruments and things. And you have the choice of a couple of V8s and a diesel now for all of those. Even Escalade is getting the diesel. Whereas with the Ford and Lincolns, you get the twin turbo 3.5 liter V6. It's an extremely good engine, but that's also the only engine choice that you get. So, and I think that the GM trucks drive a little better than the Ford ones. It is close though. I mean, the Expedition is really good. It's significantly improved in basically all the same ways that Tahoe is improved. And the Lincoln Navigator has just fabulous interiors. They look amazing. They've got great materials. So you really, honestly, you can't go wrong with either of them. I'm just giving a slight edge to GM right now.
My take is the Expedition, I think, slightly looks better. It's just, I love that grille. I think they really just nailed it with the most recent generation. And then I think Chevy and GMC win in most of the other areas. It's close with ride and handling, but then when you look at like the engine options, General Motors all the way. Interiors, it's closer than you might think, but I do think Chevy and GMC come out ahead. The last time I was in an Expedition and an Explorer and really a number of Ford SUVs, I was underwhelmed. I thought some of the characteristics I experienced in there were like some of the bad things, like the hard, structural elements, the not so great materials, the plastics, the like the vinyl-y like things. I didn't like that as much. Whereas I feel like Chevy, has done a better job of cleaning up some of that. And they've sort of got their infotainment system looking like it's just nicely positioned. I think that actually helps, little things like that. So I would give the slight edge inside the Chevy and GMC. Again, GMC, you're kind of competing against the Lincoln and a little bit against the Ford. But overall, I would give the edge to, if you're asking me Expedition versus like, a Tahoe or a Suburban, I would give the edge to Chevy. It's close, but it's also, to me, it's pretty decisive. If you're going to say which one would I recommend, I would say if you love the Expedition, get it, because that's like the psychology of purchasing a car. Like, don't try to change somebody's mind if they have a true favorite. But if you're a little more like kind of agnostic, yeah, I think the Chevys are better. And I think the GMC, when you roll that into the equation, sometimes the price, depending on what incentives are out there, the GMCs can be about the same, and I think that's where it gets, also worth a look as well on your shopping list. So I was very excited to drive this vehicle. I think it's interesting when, nameplates that don't get redesigns very often do get redesigns. Vehicles that aren't in the press fleet, frankly, all that much, get in there and we can test them, find out what's new, and go from there. I think eventually, and this was kind of the way I cast it in my story, is diesel is great for now. At some point, I think they're going to have to electrify these vehicles. The Hummer is all electric with the Ultium, which sounds like some sort of character on Transformers, but that's the battery pack that GM is going to put in the Hummer. So, I mean, to me, the future could involve like an electric Suburban, and I think that would be a great thing. So, why don't we leave it there, and how about we transition to another, really more of a crossover, but the Lexus GX460. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so we're going from SUVs that are completely and totally redesigned to one that has just been around for ages with very little change. And it feels that way, for better and for worse. in the better category, the old 4.6 liter V8, which doesn't make an awful lot of power. It only makes 301 horsepower. But it's astoundingly smooth and quiet. Like it is worthy of a luxury vehicle. It's not fast, but it's ultra refined. And the old school automatic transmission coupled to it, it does the job. It's smooth. That's kind of about all I can say for it, but that's a priority in a luxury vehicle. And
I mean, it's a beefy body on frame, like,
yeah,
SUV. I think I kind of spaced and called it a crossover there a minute ago, but I mean, this is a pretty capable SUV here for Lexus. I've always kind of liked this, if you will, although I prefer, when I look at things in the segment, I tend to prefer like 4Runner and Land Cruiser, as far as like give me the Toyota versus the Lexus. But, I mean, I don't know, did you do anything with it? Fun?
Just cruised around town. Well, and so besides kind of the engine, sort of the one main other like positive about it is that it is quiet. Comfort is all right. It could be a little bit better, but not bad. But that's kind of about where the positives end for me. The steering is really vague. It's really slow. It's imprecise. And so it does not handle well. It doesn't have a lot of grip. Not as much body roll as I expected, but it's just not something that is very confidence inspiring. And as mentioned, the V8, it doesn't make a lot of power, so it's not very quick. It's a thirsty engine. Good luck trying to get over 20 mpg ever in it. It's a little bit on the small side, which on the one hand makes it easy to maneuver, like in tight parking spaces and things, which is nice. On the other hand, it's kind of a narrow cabin. Like you're kind of up close to the doors from the driving position. And the interior is really old. It's actually got kind of a lot of plasticky plastics. The infotainment is really dated. It's not super responsive. Oh, and a weird thing about it, because so it's sold as the Toyota Land Cruiser Prado in other markets, sort of the like baby brother to the full-size Land Cruiser. And so in those other markets, you can get it with like a full-size spare mounted to the rear tailgate. And because of that, it's a swing-out tailgate, kind of like on like a Jeep Wrangler or something. Because if you had to open like a normal hatchback, you'd have to have some like crazy struts to hold up the hatch and the tire. But the problem is that this tailgate is hinged in favor of right-hand drive markets. So it swings out so that if you were in a parallel parking space, you wouldn't be able to get to the cargo area from the street because the door would be blocking your way. You'd have to like go around. Just kind of a weird thing that I noticed. It's very much like an old school off-road truck, and you can tell that it is like designed for like the outback and like the Middle East and things like that. And it's sold here with a bunch of luxury items to kind of help cover the cost. So I don't know. It's a weird thing in a market that's full of like car-based unibody crossovers designed for like on-road performance. And
I love your description of the driving characteristics, because I was literally picturing the last time I drove one of these, that really light steering. It's kind of tall. If you take a corner and you're maybe like changing the radio station or something, yeah, it can feel a little nervous, if you will, a little nerve-wracking. That engine is like, microwave a slice of pizza and, kind of slow, and it'll be done by the time the vehicle gets moving. That interior is not great. Let's put it that way. Um, yeah, good description. Let me put it that way. I almost had a flashback to the street I was on. It was back when we were in the old office over in Southfield. You might remember. I remember driving one of these and coming around a corner onto like I think Southfield Road, and I was just kind of like, ugh, ugh, okay. But people buy these things. I mean, I don't know. It's not what I would go for in the segment for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is, again, I prefer the 4Runner and the Land Cruiser on the Toyota side of things. But and this is kind of a tweener sort of thing. And it's also, like you said, really old. This thing has not had a major redesign since like, what, '09, '10, somewhere in there.
Yeah, it's been a
Um,
while. I forget the exact year, but it's been a while.
I just looked up some sales numbers here. I Wikipediaing it at this point. Literally, this thing has been locked in at 25,000, give or take a couple sales for the last 5 years for the 460. And then, yeah, for the GX 460. And so it's like, it's obviously there's like this kind of core group of people who want it. I don't know.
Like, my theory is that the buyer, like the people that buy this thing, are people that have like owned a whole bunch of them, and
Mhm.
it's exactly what they want. It's luxurious enough, and it's super super reliable, and it doesn't change so much that like they can just get into a new one and they feel right at home, and that's all they want in like a luxury car, that they're really happy with that, and they just want, like, they use theirs for like 10 years or so, and when it's finally kind of like they put like 200,000 miles on it, it's kind of worn out, and they're like, all right, I really like this, I'm just going to buy another one, I just want the new one. um, and I think that's how it goes. And I think that's kind of the same sort of buyer mindset as like the Mercedes E-Class wagon, that it's these people that's what they've always had, and so that's what they're always going to have. They just want the next one. Um, they just found like their little vehicle niche that they're like, this makes me happy, and I'm going to keep buying it. Even if in this case it's objectively worse than a lot of other cars in a similar price and design segment.
I think, I think it's interesting too that sometimes if you look around, the incentives on these things are somewhat reasonable. End of year sales. I just, for some reason, that popped into my head right now. I had a totally different train of thought. But, another thing about these is just the, like, to your point, the reliability, but also the loyalty. Lexus buyers who want this and seek it out, like this is their thing. This is what they're gonna, keep going for, again and again. So, any
Yeah.
other thoughts?
Um, I will say I would take one of these over a 4Runner in a heartbeat. Um, Mainly
Tell me
because,
why, because I would not.
well,
Tell me why.
it's mainly because the V8 in it, it's so much nicer than the V6 and 5-speed automatic in the 4Runner. And I don't think it gets much worse fuel economy, if worse at all, but it's way smoother, way quieter, and is a little gutsier than the V6 in the 4Runner. Um, and the interior is a little bit nicer. Uh, yeah, and like you don't really lose out on off-road capability. This thing still has a low range, and it's got lockers, and it's got the Toyota like off-road cruise control system. Um, it's absolutely as capable off-road as a 4Runner. Arguably, maybe even more so because it's based on the Toyota Land Cruiser Prado. So I would definitely take the Lexus over the 4Runner in a heartbeat.
I prefer the styling, especially in TRD trim. I don't really like the V8 that much because it's so old and slow. I think it's the 5.3 liter GM V8 is better. It's more powerful, but that 4.6 liter V8 in the Toyotas and the Lexus does nothing for me because it's so freaking slow. So for me, the 4Runner is a little bit of an easier, choice, even though admittedly the powertrain in that thing's not great. And the interior is not great either. To me, it's just a very visceral feel. Like I like the 4Runner. I like like how it looks. I like the bouncy, jouncy drive. I like the different TRD things you could get on it. So that's how I would land. But you're not crazy. I think maybe I'm crazy actually. So
And like I was looking at the
yeah.
prices, like a 4Runner TRD Pro starts at $50,000,
Mhm.
and a base GX 460 starts at $53,000.
Yeah.
So
The
I
other
mean,
thing too about the Lex.
so these can
Go
be
ahead.
closer than you might expect. Now, granted, like if you're smart, you would buy a 4Runner like TRD Sport or TRD Limited, which comes with like 80 to 90% of the TRD Pro's upgrades for way, way less. But like you could arguably compare a 4Runner and a GX without a huge price discrepancy.
Agreed. Totally. For me though, like to like be on your side a little bit here, the Lexus side, if you will. The ride and handling of the Lexus is, again, not great. It does at times feel like it's going to tip over, but it's more comfortable on road than say the 4Runner, which is just so, like I said, kind of off-road tuned. The interior is a bit better. I mean, again, the interior is again not great, but get inside a 4Runner interior and you're like, whoa, this is like driving a 90s Explorer or something. I'm kind of exaggerating, but that interior is pretty dated. Though they have done some things in recent years to spruce it up a bit. Uh, so yeah, I think in some ways too, the 4Runner for me is more like it is a little bit about the experience. I almost put it into the Wrangler bucket of you're not going to be comfortable when you're driving a Wrangler, but a lot of people do it just to drive around and commute and go to the mall, do whatever, go to work. I would consider being among those people. I don't do a lot of off-roading. I wish I did more. I would buy a Wrangler. It would beat me up to like commute to the office and, go wherever, go golfing and go shopping and all that good stuff. But I would still consider doing it because I like that experience. And that's where I sort of rationalize what a 4Runner is and does. And that's why I subscribe to that a little bit more than the Lexus, which does have that luxury like vibe to it, even though I think the GX 460 is one of the weaker like luxury feeling Lexus vehicles, if you will. Like there's far more luxurious Lexi, if you will. But and that's more due to like they're newer, So yeah. Any other thoughts?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up. I guess
All right.
more broadly speaking, I will say I'm surprised that Lexus hasn't added a more car-like SUV to their lineup, because basically the only ones that they have are the itty-bitty UX, and then they have the RX, which is kind of a mid-sizer. But then after that, they've got old school body-on-frame SUVs, the GX and the LX, both of which are based on Land Cruisers of different sizes. And it surprises me that they don't have like a more flagship crossover based on like the Lexus LS platform, something that could compare with Mercedes GLS or Audi Q7, something like that.
I agree with that. In some ways, I think Lexus might be good to expand its strategy a little bit in the SUV space and maybe try to compete against those brands you mentioned because I mean, they're fighting like, trench warfare here. This is like old school, straight ahead. We're going to, kind of slice and dice the Land Cruiser up. And, I think in some ways their image because Lexus has such a great image and such a good reputation. Sometimes I think maybe the Lexus consumer doesn't necessarily think, if I really want this ride and handling character, maybe I would be happier in an Audi or an Infiniti or an Acura or something. But I think rethinking some of their strategy might be good to appeal to a broader audience, even though they're like one of the most mainstream luxury brands. So what do I know? Maybe they know what they're doing. But, when you look at things, not like the direct like metric competitors to the GX460 as far as size and capability, but just things in this like segment. I mean, I do mean size. There's a lot of different things out there and a lot of different approaches. And some of the other things that are like this size are almost like lifted cars, basically. So, again, not everybody wants to like forge the, rivers and go through trees. And even if you're not going to do it, you're still signing up for that type of, driving character. So, all right, that's a lot of SUV talk. Kind of a fun little mini feature this week on the Bentley Blowers coming back, if you will. It's a continuation. This is like sort of resurrecting one of the iconic models from the 1930s, specifically 1930. It's one of the longer gaps between continuations I think we've ever seen. Tell us about this. You wrote the story. News came out this morning. It's Wednesday. What are the highlights here?
Yeah, so last year, Bentley announced that they were going to do a limited run of continuation blower Bentleys, and these are these pre-war huge. They were offered both as production cars, and they also raced some of them. It's a supercharged 4.5 liter 4-cylinder engine, in just a very old school looking car. It's a pre-war machine. It's body on frame. Feel free to double check me on this, but I think I remember, I want to say it was Enzo Ferrari, not 100% positive, but that he said something along the lines of like, the blower Bentley was like the fastest truck at Le Mans as kind of a slightly derogatory thing, even though it's very
Sounds
very
like
successful.
an Enzo statement, right?
Yeah. Like bit derogatory. Like they were very successful race cars, but they're also from the thinking of make them bigger, make them more powerful. It's kind of like a Hellcat of the late 20s, early 30s.
I love that analogy, a Hellcat of the 30s.
Yeah.
But it's also when you look at that, like those ethos, that strategy, Hellcats really are a throwback to that era where it's like we're going to take a relatively unsophisticated chassis and drop a big engine in it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what Auburn and Cord did and Cadillac for a long time until they figured out some of the rest of the car. I digress. Go on.
Yeah. So, basically to celebrate just this car in general, Bentley decided they were going to build 12 examples, brand new, based on their 1929 example, 1930 example in their collection. They restored that car, and they took like laser scans of every single part and component of that vehicle, and combined with old drawings and photos and other things, basically just reproduce the entire car from the ground up and assemble them. And they announced today that they have completed their test prototype. They're calling it Car Zero because it's not part of the 12-car production run. This is their pre-production test car. They put, 40,000 hours into building this car. They reached out to local British restoration experts and things. Like the frame was built by a company that restores boilers for steam engines. It's a neat vehicle. They even created like a new engine stand so that they could hook up the engine to their in-house engine dynamometers that they use for breaking in like their modern W12 and V8 engines, so that they could run a break-in loop on this old school supercharged 4-cylinder. And they're planning on doing a lot of like durability testing on the car. They're going to do a test loop that will give it like the equivalent of, a little over 20,000 miles of real world driving, and then about 5,000 miles of track use, just to make sure that like it doesn't wear out abnormally quickly. Like make sure that they've assembled everything properly, make sure that they don't have to make any changes. As for the 12 production examples, they will start building those like in the next year or so. All 12 have already been sold, and all the customers have made their choices on how they want to spec it out, what color, what kind of leather, that kind of stuff. One of the things that's interesting is that earlier this year, a number of very wealthy car collectors and car enthusiasts sent an angry letter to Bentley, expressing their concern about producing these continuation models. That they're worried that
cheesed Ralph Lauren off, right?
Yeah,
he's not happy.
Yeah, Ralph Lauren was one of them, the fashion mogul, and also, in case you didn't know, he's a big time car enthusiast and car collector, and has some of the finest like pre-war cars in the world. They all signed on this letter to Bentley because they were expressing concern that these continuation cars will reduce the value of the originals and make the originals less special, I guess. Which I think is completely ridiculous. And the reason for that is that just look at Shelby Cobras. There are a zillion gajillion replicas made of fiberglass and aluminum and who knows what, with Ford engines or LS engines, or some that are built in garages, some that are built by aftermarket companies. And even with the existence of all these cars, the original Shelbys are still worth oodles and oodles of money, and people still get really excited if they're looking at a real Shelby Cobra and not just some replica or continuation or something. So I really don't think that 12 continuation cars built by the same company that built the originals I don't think that's going to do anything to the value of the originals.
I think it could drive the value up, to be honest, because you're going to get publicity. People like 1929, I think I said 30. They hadn't built them since 30. It was 1929 is the actual Bentley Blower we're talking about.
That's right.
That was a long time ago, man. Like, I mean, you're talking about the year the stock market crashed. Like, you're talking about 11 years after World War I. Like, I mean, this is like, you're talking pre-war. It's almost post-war of the Great War. Like, if anything, this like brings back like, I think it makes this era of cars seem cool and special again in a way that people who are like, I mean, we're talking about it. Like, we're not the market. I mean, probably our grandparents aren't even the market for like a 29 Bentley Blower, if they had the means, if you will. So like, I think it's a great way to get a really interesting era of, car making back in the spotlight, and who cares what Ralph Lauren thinks other than the entire fashion industry, right? He's right there, but, if he's mad about 12 Bentley Blowers, so be it.
Yeah, and like we were talking a little bit about this in the office chat, and we're pointing out that this could possibly drive up the value of the originals in the sense that it brings attention to those cars again.
Exactly.
And personally, if I owned one of the originals, I would be extremely wealthy, and I would seriously consider buying one of the continuation cars and drive the heck out of that one and keep like my original in like pristine condition and not risk it. Like, because then I would have one that's not the original and I can just drive it and enjoy it as much as I want because it's not anywhere near as valuable as the original.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think to your point earlier, the extreme validation and the rigor that they are putting these continuation cars through is exceptional. I mean, what did you say, like 12,000 miles they're going to like simulate or whatever? I mean, do you think any of these cars are going to get many miles on it? I don't. You and I probably would do it, but one of those like lucky 12, I highly doubt is going to be commuting in their 1929 continuation Bentley. To me, it seems like they're almost over-engineering them and validating them and making sure that they can, at least perform at the bare minimum of what the buyer might ask. Whereas to me, these these seem to be more like destined to be museum pieces, but they're not. Bentley's not taking that approach. They're like, drive them. So
Yeah,
I guess we'll
and
see.
like one other thing, again, like if I was really wealthy, even if I didn't have an original one, I'd be kind of interested in this because in some ways it would be kind of cool because like this is the chance to actually own a vintage car but brand new. Like
Hmm.
I don't know if you've ever heard like the phrase like it's only new once. And it's like this would be your it would it's almost like time travel. It's like you'd actually be able to buy a new one. Like no one else has like driven it. It hasn't been like restored multiple times. It's factory fresh. Like that's kind of cool.
I think that's a very cool thing. I love history. I think nostalgia is a very powerful thing. There's a line in Mad Men, the hit TV show, about how it takes you back to a place maybe you wish you were and yearn to go again. Most people didn't live through the 20s. We're already back in the 20s. In fact, very few people are probably alive that lived through like the 20s, as I think people of our age would call like the 1920s. I haven't heard anybody call the 2020s the 20s yet. Have you? I don't know.
I mean, I've heard some people joke about like we're going back into the roaring 20s and
Right.
but
Call me crazy, but when you say the 20s, you think the 1920s,
yeah,
right? Or am
yeah.
I just getting old? All right. So, but I mean, to me, it's like you get that kind of Gatsbyan feel. You get to go back and get that vibe of what it was like to live through that era and drive these types of cars and do it in a way where you're not like potentially destroying like what is a priceless work of art. Whereas if it's a recreation, I think, okay, yeah, I could probably take that to Costco. I mean, not really, but I wouldn't be afraid to take it out on Sunday and drive the heck out of it within, my limits. Again, if I was some sort of wealthy person who wanted to buy these types of things.
Mhm. And
Yeah, I
actually,
think this is cool. I
now,
really do.
and now that I think about it, in the off chance that anybody from Bentley happens to be listening to our podcast, and like once all of this pandemic stuff blows over, if you want to like fly us out to Crew and like let us take Car Zero out for a spin, we'd love to do that.
Sounds good. I think Car Zero, put it through the press fleet, if you will.
Mhm.
Fly out there and give it a go. I think I mean, again, you go back to the handling and the characteristics of driving these cars. I drove a Model T one time and it was insane, although it was easier than you think. So it is very intriguing when you think about what it would be like to get the opportunity to drive something like this. So yeah, nice story. Check it out, autoblog.com. As you all know, that's why you're listening to this podcast. But that went up on Wednesday morning. So if you're listening to this on the weekend, while you're walking the dog, having drinks on your patio or whatnot, scroll back or Google it. So let's spend some money. This one comes from Jesse, who is a longtime listener of the podcast and wants to spend some money. Currently drives 2018 BMW 540i right now. Before that, has had 5 Series and 3 Series. Perennially has not chosen the best handling BMWs. Does not want to make that mistake again. Right now, they're looking at downgrading quotes to a 3 Series because they're in the market for a fun sedan, if you will, not the one with the best interior. I actually think the 3 Series interior is pretty good. I don't see a huge difference, but yeah, 5 Series is probably better. Looking at a 330i with all of the handling tricks, which I think is a good idea. This is instead of say an M340i. So that's sort of the layout, if you will. Price difference is not an issue. Looking to stay under 75 grand. The question is Jesse crazy to spend M340i money on the 4-cylinder 3 Series? What else should be considered? Other cars that have been test driven include the A4, the S60, the Alfa Romeo Giulia, the new TLX, but none of these are of interest. Can't get past the CT5's design elements, which is, I think that's a problem for Cadillac, even though I do think the CT5 looks pretty good right now. I think it looks better than the old one. G70 is tempting, but can't wait for this 4-cylinder. 835 AMG was a blast to drive, but is a bit raw. I'd agree with that. Great email. Thanks for writing, Jesse. What do you think, Joel?
Yeah, so first off, I'm extremely impressed by the amount of research and test driving that this person has done. Like, I'm really impressed. Like, this is great. Um, uh, and honestly, I'm gonna have a hard time. Like one of the things that I would have jumped at saying would be Alfa Romeo Giulia, but you've driven that and you didn't like it, so that's off the list. And I guess really the only thing I would say is before you write off the G70 just yet, go ahead and try out the G70 4-cylinder. I would recommend the V6, but it does feel nose heavy. I've driven both of them, and I do like the lighter feel of the 4-cylinder one of those. That twin turbo V6 in the G70 it's a big heavy engine. I still really like the V6 one, but I think you would probably be disappointed by the nose heaviness of it. But I would definitely check out the 4-cylinder G70 because just as a whole, the G70 is a spectacular handling car. I love it to death. It's probably my favorite car in the segment. I think I would agree, like the A35 or like its twin, the CLA 35. Our editors, I know that James Riswick, he has been very disappointed with the ride quality on that car, that it's kind of rough. So honestly, like I would say, check out a G70 just to be sure. But after that, honestly, I think a 330i with the handling options would be a good choice. And like I was pricing it out, and even with the handling upgrades, you're still going to come in probably less than you would if you bought like an M340i with the stuff that you want. So I think it would make a lot of sense. And like the BMW 4-cylinder engines, well, BMW engines in general are some of the best in the business. Like they're really, really, really good. And they feel underrated. Like they feel much punchier than the numbers that they give. Actually, and I don't know if maybe you were going to suggest this, Greg, but maybe check out Mercedes C-Class. Mercedes makes really good, actually, and even the Mercedes E-Class is really, really nice. But otherwise, like you're definitely not crazy to pick a 330i over the M340i. You'll save a little money. Like if it feels better to you, that's great. And like with the extra money you save, you can spend on other stuff. And like BMW's engines, they feel underrated. So like the 4-cylinder is going to feel good. So what do you think, Greg?
330i all the way. I like BMW sedans. I always have. I think the 3 Series holds a special place for me, even though I'm sure I don't think it, I think it has a tough time living up to the legend that is the 3 Series, that we all sort of put that pressure onto that car. That being said, I think it handles well. I think it looks pretty good. I think BMW's cars they need a little bit of a design, I think, like clean sheet approach, just the grills, they're getting, it's a little bit not what I want it to be. But based on the preferences here, based on previous ownership experience, and based on the values, I think it's a pretty good move. I think the writer will be happiest with this. This is one of those examples earlier in the show we were talking about. There may be something that's better in the segment, and I would argue the C-Class is better. The interior is a little bit better. I prefer the exterior design. I think it may be even, handling's about the same. But I would argue, if you're like scoring them, that the C-Class is better than the 3 Series right now. That being said, if you're a BMW person and all of the reasons that people are BMW people, a Mercedes isn't going to make you happy. It's not. So, yeah, I feel pretty good about that. I would go with the 330. I think it's a reasonable play. It's fun. It's emotional. I get why the writer has such a strong preference for BMWs in the past. It wants to get that more engaged, visceral experience for this next purchase. So yeah, that's how I would fall. It's a really interesting segment. The G70 is a brilliant car. in some ways, Genesis has the grille that's proportioned and executed the way that I think BMW should look at some of its cartoonish grills. The Cadillac's an interesting car, the CT4, the CT5. I like how they look, but I feel like right now Cadillac is going to need a generation of good sedans to try to get people to subscribe to them as premium cars versus just these raw, crazy, powerful cars with brilliant chassis but rough interiors. The Alfa, I always would throw the Alfa on the list too. It's an emotional car, handles great, looks great, interior is not great. Some of the electronics and things aren't so good, but yeah, to try to bring this together, 330i, maybe we're kind of confirming what they're asking, but I think that's okay.
I think 330i makes sense. I'd still say check out a G70 4-cylinder, and while I do mention C-Class, one of the downsides is that they haven't updated. I know that at least on the AMG, I think is still using the old V6, and I don't think the 4-cylinder in that is quite as nice as the BMW engine. So
yeah, I'd agree with that.
So it's one of those things that, yeah, I think you have pretty much narrowed. I think like 330i does make sense. I do still say check out a G70. I love that car so much. It handles amazing. Even if the powertrain is a little bit worse. It would be my pick over the BMW. But I mean, everything you've said, it sounds like the 330i makes sense. And definitely, like, looking at the handling upgrades, I don't think anything there is going to make the ride any worse. Like, it should still be just as comfortable, but just handle better. So I think you'd be quite happy with the 330i with the handling upgrades.
Agreed. And I will take your G70 sort of suggestion, throw in the Alfa Romeo Giulia, even though just if you're looking to try something different before you end up with the BMW 3 Series, but also very impressive job here of researching and test driving all these vehicles. Normally we tell people to do that. Jesse already did that, so that's great. And that's all the time we have this week on the Autoblog podcast. Thanks for joining me this week, Joel. Everybody have a great weekend. Be safe out there. We will see you next week.